Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to talk to you about nutrition. And so this is going to be part one of a three-part series on nutrition. There's so much to discuss when it comes to nutrition. There's calories, which are the energy storage in food and why we need to eat in order to acquire energy. There's the important macromolecules that are found in food, such as carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. There's a whole discussion about minerals and vitamins. What do they do? Why are they important? You can talk about undernourishment, overnourishment. You can talk about basal metabolic rate. There's all kinds of stuff. Body mass index, percent body fat. There's all kinds of eating disorders that could come up in conversation. And so, going to break it up into three parts. And so this is the first part. And what I want to say about this right out of the gate is, nutrition is such an important topic, and it's an interesting one. You can major in college in nutrition, and it involves a lot of chemistry, as you can imagine, but it's very interesting. And it also is, even if you're not majoring in it, you could everyone could serve to read a little bit more about nutrition, understand food labels, and be just a better advocate of eating right and leading your family on the road to nutritious food. And so it's a very important conversation. So I hope you learn something from it and enjoy it as well. So here's this picture of salmon here, which is very delicious and also very nutritious. It contains important essential fatty acids. And so we need those in our diet, and also it contains very important protein. And so that's some of the things that we're going to be talking about. In addition to getting fuel, energy from food, we need carbon skeletons. In other words, like just these molecules contain carbon, and we're going to need those in our diet. And so that's part of it. And so I want to start off in this particular segment talking about carbohydrates. You might be familiar with them, but I'll just run you through some of the basics of carbohydrates. Some carbohydrates can be simple, like monosaccharides, or simple sugars, like glucose and fructose, which are found in fruits such as these blackberries. And we eat these as a source of energy mostly. And we can also eat complex carbohydrates that are sometimes called polysaccharides, which are found in the form of starch. And so these contain a lot more calories than do monosaccharides. So they're very nutritious, and they provide lots of energy. There's another polysaccharide that's important, but we don't break it down and digest it. We can't hydrolyze it, so it's not used as a source of energy. It's called cellulose. We commonly call that as fiber. And so I put a picture here of celery because it contains a lot of fiber. And so it provides the bulk in the food, which helps to move the food through the alimentary canal of the digestive system. And so this is very important. Cellulose, even though we don't get any calories from it, it's important for proper health, especially in the colon, to move food through. And so carbohydrates are broken down in the digestive system. They're first broken down in our oral cavity by salivary amylase, breaks down starch a little bit, but then ultimately pancreatic amylase, and then ultimately these disaccharide aces are produced by the intestinal mucosal layer. And then they're broken down to the most simple sugars of all, which are glucose, fructose, and galactose. And then those molecules, such as fructose, galactose, and glucose, when they're in the intestinal lumen, will then simply diffuse into the mucosal layer of our intestinal villi. And then what's interesting, I find this kind of curious, that in the liver, it converts fructose and galactose to glucose. It's sort of the preferred monosaccharide. And then our body, in between meals, will take the excessive glucose that we've eaten and then store it in its own polysaccharide. So we have polysaccharides in our body. It's called glycogen. Sometimes it's known as animal starch. And so this chain of glucose can be found in our muscle cells and can be found in our liver. And then if there's even more glucose in all of our glycogen stores, and when I say stores, meaning sort of the pantry of glycogen in our muscle and our liver, there's a set amount that our body will like to prefer to store in the form of glycogen because it's kind of a heavy molecule. And so if we continue to eat, our body will then convert the glucose into triglycerides, which are stored in our adipose tissue. And this is not altogether a bad thing, because again, it is only until recently that our society has so much food available that, you can think of this evolutionarily speaking, that what a great adaptation it is to be able to store excess food, and then we can utilize it later when food isn't as plentiful. So glycogen is a carbohydrate store, and triglycerides are a fat storage, and we store that in adipose tissue. And so when we take in more calories than we use, we store it for later, and that's what we were just talking about. The liver and the muscle will store glycogen, which is a polymer, polysaccharide, of many glucose, and then glucose can then be used for fuel upon needed. And so there's hormones that regulate sugar balance. So in other words, if we take in a lot of sugar, there's a hormone called insulin that's going to lower blood sugar level and help store it in the form of glycogen. And then in between meals, we have a hormone called glucagon, which will then release glycogen in the form of glucose into our blood and from our liver and muscles, so that we can have that when we need it. But it's kind of neat. Like, I don't want you to be a hater on fat, because fat's really important. It's how we store a lot of calories when we don't when we're not eating, and also it's very lightweight because it's hydrophobic, and so that's kind of important. So here's a picture of this really strong looking bike rider here finishing one of the legs on a ride from San Francisco to Los Angeles, coming into the city of Ventura. The human body generally expends glycogen first. I like to think of glycogen, that polysaccharide, as being, storage right here. Glycogen, this is our chain of glucose. We tend to burn that first, and it'll vary from individual to individual, but basically we're burning off that glycogen when we're exercising for around, and these are all approximate, around 30 minutes. We're burning that, and then if you continue to exercise, then you'll start to dip into your triglyceride reserves, which are found in your adipose tissue. So it's always a good idea to really load up on your carbohydrate if you're competing in a race of where it's a duration of a long distance. And so, as I was mentioning, these hormones, insulin is produced by the pancreas, and what it's trying to do is lower our blood sugar after we eat a meal so that we could store it in the form of glycogen. But then in between meals, when the blood sugar is low, then we can release glucagon also from the pancreas, which is then going to raise the blood sugar level. So this keeps the sugar levels kind of static, which we like to call homeostasis in the blood. Okay, and so we need that. That's a fair question. Why do you need to have a constant amount of glucose in the blood? Because there's cells that really, really need it. Like, for example, neurons really use a lot of glucose, especially in the brain, because they're doing all that thinking and listening to instructional videos and pondering the world's problems and solutions. And so these neurons need to take in a lot of glucose because they need to convert it into ATP, which is then used by the sodium-potassium pump to maintain a resting membrane potential. So there you go. So the neurons need a constant supply of glucose, and so if it's scarce, that's trouble. If glucose gets really, really, really low, you're just going to start to feel fatigued. And so there's actually another hormone called cortisol. This is a stress hormone. And this cortisol, which is produced by the adrenal glands, will allow for even amino acids to be converted to glucose, and then glucose is increased in the bloodstream. And so a bit of a sad topic that I'm going to venture into at this moment. And so I don't mean to turn everything so serious and somewhat depressing, but these are facts that I think we need to be aware of. That there's some severe problems that can occur if our energy budget, if you will, it gets out of balance. And so if the diet is chronically, meaning for a long time, deficient in calories. That condition is called undernourishment. Undernourishment results. So not having enough calories. And so what does this mean? Well, that means that your glycogen storage in your muscle has been used, your glycogen in the liver has been used, and your body's been running on the adipose tissue for a long time. And eventually it runs out of those two fuel sources. And so in times of crisis, like undernourishment, what the body will attempt to do, it doesn't prefer it, but it will have to break down its own protein for a source of fuel in order to survive. And so it'll start to eat away, if you will, at its own muscles. And this is a tragedy because proteins really run the whole body. And so eventually this will affect the brain, and it'll affect growth and all the metabolic reactions of enzymes. It's very bad. It'll affect your immune system because antibodies are proteins, and so the whole body starts to suffer as a result of that. And so what's even more sad is that when you consider this worldwide, this undernourishment, you can see over here in this chart that the dark red indicates a staggering 35% of the population is undernourished. And so look at this, a huge portion of mid to southern Africa is undernourished. This is, again, I don't want to make a commentary too much about this, but it's unacceptable. It's like you see that there are other countries, for example, in the United States and Europe and such, that have plentiful amount of food. And I know it's not a simple solution, and obviously I'm not the first person to think of it, but I think there's a responsibility for the world to come to the aid of those who are undernourished, because it's something that is avoidable. And so now shifting gears a little bit, there's, in terms of eating disorders, sometimes undernourishment and having problems with your diet can be caused by physiological means. In other words, hormones could be out of balance, and so therefore you have a propensity to lose too much weight or gain too much weight. And then sometimes eating disorders can be psychological, and so sometimes individuals can be depressed, and it's sad. Things are not going well, there's some tragedies in one's life, and you start to feel bad about it. And so those individuals sometimes have the propensity to look at themselves and have a low self-esteem, and think no matter how thin they are, they feel that they're overweight. And so their reflection of themselves tends to be overweight when in fact they're not. They're actually undernourished. And so this is what we would call anorexia. And so anorexia is sort of an aversion to body fat. And so a person tends to reduce their calories in their diet such that they become in jeopardy. And then in some instances, there's a side to this called bulimia, which a person will induce vomiting and in order to kick back the food. And so they'll eat it, and then they'll vomit, and so therefore they'll continue to lose weight as well. And so if you're interested in anorexia and bulimia, I welcome you to pursue that a little bit further. It's pretty sad. And so now on the flip side of undernourishment, there's overnourishment, and so obesity. And so the thing about obesity is that it's rather surprising how many individuals these days are borderline obese or even crossing over the line into obesity. And so this results from excessive intake of food. And this is kind of a common problem in the United States, especially these days in other affluent nations. And so we have a tendency to, food tastes great, and if it's readily available and if it's affordable, we are likely to continue to eat until we overnourish ourselves. And so let's talk about that for a second. And you're like, well, how do you determine it? Like, you can't just randomly say, you're obese or I'm not obese. Like, there must be some sort of, quantitative analysis that would determine it. And that's what I want to talk to you about. There's something called BMI, or body mass index. It's the ratio between your height and weight, And it's a mathematical formula that correlates with your body fat, and you can determine whether or not you're over the number that you need to be for being healthy, and then whether or not you're obese. But I just wanted to say before I show you that, having a high BMI, high body mass index, puts you at risk. It's not just an aesthetic thing. It puts you at risk for developing hypertension, which is high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, hardening of the arteries, which can cause, and this is very serious, can cause a heart attack or a stroke. And then even diabetes can result from having a high BMI. And so you're like, what is it? Well, if you look at this chart right here in pounds, if you find yourself on the chart, okay, this is how much I'm weighing in pounds. And so I'm going to put myself out there. Maybe it's not a good idea, but I'm just, I'm going to do it anyway, just for the sake. So say I'm approximately 200 pounds. Sometimes I'm a little bit more, sometimes I'm a little bit less. This is the way it is. And so if I look over here in terms of my height, okay, so I'm about 5'11", so I'm going to go right here. So the way it's going to work is I'm going to just draw the line up like that, and then come over here like that. And so how about this? I didn't need the chart to tell me that I'm a little bit overweight. I'm sometimes, this is the way it is. I'm not going to make excuses. But look how close I am to being obese, because having a BMI 30 and above is considered to be obese. And so this is what we're talking about. And so you might say to yourself, boy, don't be so hard on yourself, Mr. Sinti. And I'm like, well, this is the way it is, And so you look into the mirror, and this is not, imagining overweight. This is reality overweight. So you can calculate your body mass index by following these steps. So you multiply your weight in pounds if you don't have a chart, although you can get a chart. Multiply your weight in pounds by 703, then multiply your height in inches by itself, and then divide the first number by the second and round up to the nearest whole number, and that's your BMI. Or you can just look at a chart. And so that's kind of a cool thing. There's even, here, let me take a break for a second. There's even websites that will calculate this. Like, check this out. Here's a BMI calculator. I like that. And so you can type this in and go, all right, so I'm 5 feet, 11 inches, and I weigh 200 pounds. What is my BMI? So 27.9 or 28. So getting close to obese. Maybe, perhaps I shouldn't have put myself so far out there like that. Hopefully, if you're watching this video, you're more sympathetic of the situation. So there you have it. So you can calculate your BMI by looking at a website or doing those calculations. Again, here's a map of the United States, state by state, sort of a political map right here. Notice, look at this here. This is 2010. This is the Center for Disease Control. Look at this. 35% of Americans are obese. 35%. That's 35%. 17% of children are obese. Okay, this is a serious problem. And then again, you can look at this regionally in terms of, like, it appears to be like the southern states seem to be having a little bit more problem. And so if you're interested in, preventing this, you're going to go about talking about nutrition, you're going to talk about exercise and some cultural things that are happening down here in order to address it. And so it's fascinating to me. So the human body, has a tendency to store fat. And so I mentioned before that isn't altogether a bad thing, because we use those triglycerides when times are low in terms of energy. But too much, just eating and not exercising and burning the calories, is what leads to the trouble. And so this is a picture of a triglyceride. And so while the fat hoarding can be a liability today, like we're talking about, it actually provided fitness advantage. That means like reproductive fitness, not like physical fitness. In other words, organisms that were in the past, like our ancestors that were more hunter-gatherers, those individuals in the population that had the wherewithal, the genes perhaps, to store extra energy in the form of fat were the ones that were surviving times of famine. And so we are the ancestors of those individuals. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. So despite the propensity to store fat or to lose fat, our body pretty much stays fairly the same, and it tends to accumulate over many years. And so that's why I think it kind of creeps up on individuals. And so most dieters who diet and cut down their calorie intake rather dramatically will then return to their sort of former weight after they stop dieting. Now, I'm briefly mentioning that this is a huge conversation in and of itself in terms of regulation of weight in the body and how that works. And so we have a little bit of an understanding on this. Now, there's a hormone called leptin, and this hormone leptin is thought to play a key role in this whole process that we're talking about in weight gain, because it's produced by adipose tissue cells itself, and it's complex. It's a feedback mechanism of regulating fat storage and usage. And so this is kind of interesting. So high leptin levels will cause the brain to depress appetite. And so this is maybe a good thing if you're overweight. And conversely, like low body fat decreases the leptin level. And so that signals the brain to increase your appetite and then ultimately increase your weight gain. So it's hormonally controlled as well. It's not just, willpower. And so these feedback mechanisms help to maintain sort of a homeostasis in individuals. And then another important conversation that I want to bring up is something called basal metabolic rate. So this is not your body mass index. This is basal metabolic rate. And you're like, what is that, BMR? You're like, you didn't know you had a BMR. Well, it's the number of calories. Remember, all of the food contains calories. It's the number of calories you need to sustain your body, like just to keep it going every day at rest. And so this is like the minimum calories that your body uses just to get through the day. And then, of course, it would increase, your BMR increases the more exercise that you're putting out, okay? And so how is this determined? So it's the calories depends on your gender, your age, your body frame, your weight, the percentage of body fat in terms of your weight. And so just briefly, now there's some ranges on this to be considered, but your typical woman who's around 5'4", 5'5", and weighs around 140 is going to have about a 2,000 calorie BMR. And a gentleman who's 5'10", 180 pounds will consume about 500 calories more than that at BMR, 2,500. And so your activity level really affects this. If you're a sedentary individual, then that's kind of what we're talking about. But if you're active, your body's going to require a lot more calories because you're going to be burning it. But this is an important point. Regardless of whether you consume fat, you consume carbohydrates or protein, if you take in more calories required to maintain your body size and you don't burn it off, you're going to store it. I think it's kind of obvious. You're going to store it if you exceed that number. And so what's interesting is research is conducted. We use individuals, humans sometimes, but mainly laboratory organisms are good at doing this. These are mice. And so researchers at the University of California, Davis, have identified genes involved in fat homeostasis. And so it's very complex. And so there's several chemical signals that help underline the brain's ability to regulate fat levels in the adipose tissue. And so these are thought to be antagonistic, and so maybe we could target these genes with medication to sort of help individuals who are really severely obese, so that we can help them. And again, I just wanted to point out that obesity in some instances are beneficial. Like, for example, in these seabirds, it's important for chicks to become obese when their parents are feeding them, especially when, again, to survive periods where it's tough to find food. And so, calculating your BMR is kind of a cool thing to do, your basal metabolic rate. And so I can, again, go to a website, you can do BMR calculator, and you can go, all right, my current weight is 200 pounds, and let's see here, I'm 5 foot 11 inches, and my age is surprisingly young at 49, and I am male. And so how about that? So around 1,800 calories per day is my BMR. And so, again, if I'm exercising, that's going to be a little high. If I'm not exercising, then this is probably the amount of calories that my body's going to be needing. All right. So a brief look at part 1 of nutrition. I hope you're enjoying it, and I hope you stay tuned to see part 2 and part 3. Thanks for watching.